this event is from a webinar series called the ROI from a Zero Listen podcast. Now, before we get into that too much, as folks are still coming in, I was once asked when I was giving a presentation of this before to give a brief introduction of myself. Well, if you're on LinkedIn, you already have that. So there's who I am, marketing executive, background in audio video production, and the co-founder of Content Master. So what is a Zero Listen podcast? Now, we all think, well, podcasts are designed to be listened to, right? Well, if you're in podcasting for business, it's a bit different. A Zero Listen podcast is a strategic podcast tool used by companies to create valuable content and establish new connections. And the success is measured by its business impact rather than show listenership. And I'll explain that today and how you can benefit from a Zero Listen podcast and how you can get ROI from that Zero Listen podcast. And also, most importantly, how you can explain that to those who are approving or funding the budget for your Zero Listen podcast. Now, the goal isn't to get zero listens, but I want you to understand how much the ROI matters, even if you didn't have any listeners. So, part one of the Zero Listen podcast series is content ROI from podcasting. How do you get a large content ROI from a Zero Listen podcast? So the first important thing is to understand the difference between a business podcast and an entertainment podcast. Now, we won't go in depth of those two differences, but we will go into the business podcast characteristics. So for a business podcast, the format, tone, and audience are very different from, say, an entertainment podcast. They are structured. They may be semi-scripted, and the important word here is semi-scripted because you don't want to have your podcast scripted. You want to have bullet points for a conversation. They are more professional in tone. They can be technical. They can even use industry jargon because you know who you're speaking to. And in fact, your communication will be specifically targeted to your audience. And your audience may be your potential customers, your industry peers. Even for an internal podcast, it could be to your employees. So the purpose is very different for a business podcast. It's going to be for business awareness, to help build your authority in your industry. Thought leadership, having your internal thought leaders, maybe thought leaders from other areas of the industry, sharing that information with your audience. Also, you can boost your content output. And we're going to get into that pretty much deeply in this particular part of the series because we're talking about content ROI from your Zero Listen podcast. And of course, lead generation is also a factor too. We'll get into that into the third part of this series. So, business podcasts already have key content wins from business podcasting, such as overcoming content and resource challenges. Often businesses or marketing teams are wondering, what do we write about next? What do we talk about next? How do we keep our blog fresh? How do we keep content that resonates and answers our customers' questions? Well, your business podcast can solve all of those things by having those conversations with people in your industry, within your company, to create fresh, ROI-rich and SEO-rich content. Also, by having conversational content, it makes your content more relatable and more trustworthy. And finally, when you create content with faces and voices of industry leaders, then you're creating content that's much more engageable, much more attractive, much more authentic, as we hear so much, because you have actual people creating this content. So here's the most important thing when you're trying to understand and measure your podcast. You have to understand, what business are you in? You may be in industrial manufacturing. You may be in technology. You may be a SaaS company. You need to understand what business that you're in. And the most important thing to know is that you're not in the podcast business. You're not in the podcast business. You're looking to market or promote the business that you have. And this is key because often we measure or we read about statistics that measure podcasts based on people who are in the podcast business. And you'll find, and we're going to discuss in a moment, that the things you want to measure your podcast by have little to nothing to do with the statistics, that you measure a podcast by if you're in the podcast business. You are not in the podcast business. You're in your respective industries. So it's safe to ignore those popular metrics that you see when people are talking about their podcast when they're in the podcast business. Now, those metrics are ones that you find on your hosting platform or your individual podcast aggregates like your Apple statistics or your Spotify statistics. Those are your downloads, your subscribers, your listens. And these are only useful when your podcast is your business, or if you're selling ads, or if you depend on your podcast to sell your product from your podcast. These are only useful in these cases. If your business is not the podcast business, and if you're not selling ads from your podcast, then the most popular statistics that you see, downloads, subscribers, listeners, do not matter in this case. And I'll tell you in a moment which ones really do matter for you. But first, let's get into some tactics of how you can have success when you create a zero listen podcast. Of course, again, your goal is not to create zero listens for your podcast. Your goal is to not worry about the listens that your podcast has because you have other goals in mind. So the promotion tactics for that, 5 parts: helping your guests promote, email promotion, the website journey of your customer, and then the combination of repurposing in social media. So let's get into each one of these, and I'll show you how you can use each one of these 5 to make sure you're gaining ROI in the content created from your podcast. So first of all, you want to help your guests to promote. This is an example of a podcast that actually I was a guest on, and even though we preach this and we teach this, I was really impressed by how this company and this podcast sent us what we call a content pack after the podcast. They sent an email thanking me for being on the podcast, but they also sent a link to a folder that has multiple kinds of content in multiple formats. They sent audio clips, video clips. They sent text that was already formatted for LinkedIn post or Twitter post. They sent images to use with those posts. That made it very easy for me to share their podcast. So what happens is, as a guest, they're using me. They're getting access to my audience by making it easy for me to promote them. They gave me content, and everyone wants free content. Content is not always easy to create, or you don't always have time to create it. So having someone else give you the content, or in this case, giving your guests content to post, will help them promote your podcast. Now, to flip it around, on my own podcast, The Business of Marketing, we did the same thing. We always send out a thank you email to our guests to make sure that we can utilize our guests' audience to promote the podcast, promote our company, our brand, whatever our message is and what we stand for. We want to make sure that we help our guests help us. Now, in this case, I was honored to have Seth Godin as my guest on the podcast on The Business of Marketing. The email went out, and as we do with everyone, we send them different types of content that they may use. Now, here's an important point. Everyone will not use every type of content, but it's important to have multiple types of content so that they can use the type of content that's preferable to them. In this case, we didn't expect Seth Godin to use YouTube videos or graphics. Seth Godin is a blogger. We hope to get a mention on Seth's blog. And sure enough, we did get a mention on Seth's blog and links back to our website. Key back to our website. We'll get to that in a moment as well, the importance of that. But in this case, we help Seth help us by providing content. Now, email promotion. Now, this isn't about emailing to promote necessarily your podcast. It's about having information created from the podcast. You have a newsletter. You may have a database of people. So now you have more content to share with your audience. Because the podcast episode happened, you had a conversation, you discussed some information that would be useful to your audience. So send a newsletter out that says, hey, on this episode, we talked about some things we know you're interested in. So you may give a few bullets of the takeaways. You may give a list of some of the things you discussed in the podcast. You want to include an image because, of course, faces drive interest. So your email comes up in your prospective customer or your audience's inbox. They see an image of some people they want to know more about. They see some answers perhaps you may have discussed in the episode. And so remember, this is business. The goal is to get more traffic to your website and awareness of your brand. You're not caring about getting traffic to Apple or Spotify. You want to get the traffic to your business. This is a business podcast. So that's what's most important here. So the next thing is the website journey. You want to keep your end game in mind. And the end game is to get your listeners or viewers or consumers of your content to your website. So I was sitting one Sunday afternoon and had this thought come up. So I pulled out my iPad and I began doodling. I thought about, you create social posts from your podcast, emails from your podcast. You have your podcast playing on Apple or Spotify. There should always be links that lead back to a page on your website that has additional information about your podcast. It has the player, it has the episode description, perhaps the transcript. All of this is on your website. So now you've already gained a website visitor who has a chance to see other things and look more into your company because now they're on your website. I see so many companies who don't even have a presence on their website for their podcast, which means they also don't have a destination. So regarding that destination, you not only want to have an individual page for that podcast episode, you also want to have a page for the podcast that says, the name of your podcast, all the episodes listed out. This gives your viewers of your podcast, as they look through your website rather, that gives them a chance to look through your resources and perhaps binge listen to your content. They can scroll through the subjects, they can scroll through the titles of your episodes and begin to listen to several episodes. And because it's a podcast, of course, when they're not on your website, they can take it with them, provided that you have the embeds and the links to subscribe to your podcast on your website. Okay. Now, of course, the part that all marketers love or should love is repurposing their content, and social media is a great channel for that. So let's just give you a high level of some things you can create from a podcast, especially if it's a video podcast. You have your video highlights for YouTube and Facebook and LinkedIn that can be 2 to 5 minutes long. Micro content for TikTok or Twitter, X, YouTube Shorts or Instagram. Audio and micro audio such as waveforms and audio text animations. All these things can be utilized in your email promotion, in your web pages, and of course you want to put it in your social media scheduler so that you have this content scheduled out. In fact, this content can be scheduled. What we do for the business of marketing, we may have an episode, let's say, for example, it's January. That episode may have content scheduled January, February, April, July, August, September. That content is compounding because for the next episode, the same thing happens. 2 weeks, 4 weeks, 2 months, 8 months out. We're scheduling pieces of each episode out. And all those episodes, imagine you're 40 episodes in and they're all pointing back to your website. That gives you, as Mark Schaefer says, a cumulative advantage of all these podcasts building up, all these links linking back to your company. And over time, you will see a growth in traffic back to your website because of all the content that your podcast is producing. Again, this is about content ROI. You're producing more and more content from your podcast that is leading to web traffic. Now, let's go deeper into the repurposing. I'm going to give you a format that we use that just a template that originated with a particular client, but now it's kind of a base of how we repurpose content for a podcast. So let's imagine you have an audio podcast. And this audio podcast, of course, has the episode itself and it has its graphics. Now, of course, you're going to send it out through the traditional RSS feed to Apple and to Spotify. You have your audio embed that you can use on your website and a website landing page. You have your own newsletter, in other words, your company's newsletter. Now, once you have that audio clip, you add your social copy, your social text to that. And now you can use it in your guest pack we mentioned earlier. Use it in your guest pack, your social post. I just mentioned 4 here. Of course, it could be dozens over the course of a year. And then your social newsletter, such as your LinkedIn newsletter, your Medium newsletter, newsletters that are social newsletters. You also want to place the content in there as well. You can also make a highlight article on your website if there's a particular topic or highlight from an episode, from a conversation. Use the information from that, the transcription, create an article to dive deeper into that particular area, and of course include the embed from the episode, whether it be video or audio, into the web page. And that all, as we said earlier, goes back to your website landing page. Again, this is about creating content ROI from your podcast, regardless of the number of listens. For video, it's very similar, except you have actually even more content because in addition to the audio output to Apple and Spotify and your audio embeds, your landing page, you also have a video to utilize on those pages as well. That video can produce video clips, additional social copy. Here's an additional step. You get to make a highlight video. It could be like 5-6 minutes of your 30-minute podcast, a highlight video. You'll notice that even though, for example, talking about the entertainment versions, a lot of podcasts that were on YouTube before that have gone to the big places like Spotify, they still do highlight videos on YouTube for free because people want to watch the highlights. So you create a highlight video for your podcast. Of course, you also have your full length video for your podcast. And then you want to have your shorts for YouTube Shorts or TikTok or whatever the short platform is of the day. And then still send those through your guest pack, through your social post, through your social newsletter, your highlight articles. You could have multiple now because you have these video clips you can put, and also be sure to send this traffic, all of this content you're creating, back to your website. In this picture alone, at a minimum, there's about 14 pieces of content being created just from this one episode. That's before you get into additional social posts. So, or counting up each individual short or highlight you may make. So at minimum, 14, 15 pieces of content here. So what your podcast should feed. This is a clip we made for a particular client as well, giving them a strategy of how to use their audio content and their website content from the point where Content Monster produced the show. They had their audio feed, they had several audiograms, they sent the information to their guest in a content pack, which also fed to the guest network, to their own social network. The video content created those different types of video. We repurposed clips across multiple platforms, and those clips also went to the guest network and to the own social channels of that particular company. So you should be seeing audio content, website written content, video content, sales enablement content. That's an important one. And we'll get deeper into that in the third part of this series about feeding your pipeline with your podcast. But when you have clips that sales can use to support their selling points or to respond to objections, they can pull up that short. They can send a link to that video highlight. They can send a link to the entire podcast if it goes deeper into the conversation. And now that salesperson can have your potential client's attention for 30 or 40 minutes, a time span which the salesperson obviously would not have that on a phone call with someone or an email. Now they can use this content as a sales enablement tool as well. Also, of course, you're going to feed your guest social channels. And the big one I love is creating new relationships. You're talking with industry experts, which adds to the weight of your brand. It adds to the verification of your knowledge and your brand. You can talk to potential customers. You can talk to other people in your industry that can strengthen their brand, your brand, and you can build new relationships you can follow up on later on. Now, I want to reiterate, the people consuming this content may never listen to your podcast. I had someone once say to me that they love my podcast. They quoted something from my podcast, and it turns out they had gotten the podcast clip from LinkedIn. They had never listened to the podcast. So, does it matter? No, it does not matter if someone does not listen to your podcast because of the amount of content that you're going to generate. Listenership is not your goal. Business is. Business is your goal on the podcast, not listenership. You're not trying to hit the #1 chart for podcast listenership. You want to talk to the right people, the right prospects. You want to inform your audience, not everyone's audience. There may not be the number of people even in your target audience to compare to a #1 rated podcast. So if anyone comes to you, to your company, and says, we're going to give you a #1 rated podcast, you should stop right there. That is not the goal of your podcast. Your goal of your podcast is to drive ROI from a business standpoint. So speaking of business, we have to address the classic sales or marketing funnel. We're familiar with the awareness stage, the interest stage, the consideration stage, the action stage. So content derived from your podcast can definitely influence these areas. And we'll go deeper into this in the third episode, the third part of this. But right now, let's just tell you, your video, your social media, in your awareness stage, in your interest stage, your podcast itself, your newsletters feed into the interest of your listeners or viewers. Once they get into the consideration stage, you have case studies. A conversation about a case, especially with a customer, is in essence a case study. You're discussing how that particular client or scenario or your experience went. This is key in the consideration stage, not to mention you're going to answer a lot of their frequently asked questions in that stage. Now, when your potential customers or audience are looking to take an action, then your podcast can lead them to the place where they can take that action. Again, we mentioned earlier, it should lead back to your website in all cases. All right. So your customers as guests, of course, are instant testimonials as well. So measuring ROI. And this is a very important part because as marketers, we have to justify all of our actions. And so let's talk about how you measure this. First of all, I want to go back to what we mentioned earlier about metrics that are important and which ones are not important. So we mentioned earlier, if you missed us earlier on, go back and when we finish this and see the metrics that really don't matter if you're in business creating a podcast. But what the ones that do matter are found in your website analytics, your marketing automation platform, and your CRM. And these items are going to be your brand awareness, your authority. Again, these are soft metrics, but they matter the most when you're doing a podcast. Engagement with your website. We're driving traffic back to your website. That's why this metric matters the most. You want to increase your content output. This has the highest value and it is easy to measure, and I'll tell you how in a moment. And of course, we want to get leads. That's hard to attribute, but it has a high value. So your podcast is a multi-touch machine. Now you're talking sales language here. Multi-touch machine, because we know it takes multiple touches to get someone to take an action. So it helps you stay at the top of mind during the sales process, and it lets you educate your customer before your competitor does. Someone's going to educate that customer and push them towards the purchase. It might as well be you. And the content you create from your podcast can certainly make that happen. So let's get into some details here to make sure you understand what to do and how to do it. So why should you measure? Of course, we understand why you should measure it because we have to justify our spend. We have to justify the actions here. Your episode can be repurposed into blogs and newsletters and videos. And even with 0 listens, this asset of a podcast creates other assets and creates efficiency in content creation. So we want to measure that. What do we measure? We measure the increase in your content output. We measure the reuse of the content that you're creating. And we also want to measure as you go across these additional channels, are you being more effective on your social channels, more effective on your website, more effective being part of sales enablement? That's what you measure. How do you measure it? I don't want to leave you hanging without a how. So you want to track where and how your podcast content is being repurposed across those channels. Set a baseline on how much content you're creating now per month before you start measuring the podcast. In other words, how many blogs are we able to create? How many good blogs? Again, this isn't about mass quantities of fluff. It's about quality and quantity. So how many blogs are we creating now? How many quality social posts are we able to create now? Are we even creating any multimedia content? So you find that baseline and then measure over time how you're creating additional pieces of content that fulfill those channels of blogs and social posts and multimedia. Where is that data? That data is going to be in your content management systems where you keep these social clips, where you keep your audio and your video, and your social media. It's going to be in your content calendars. Is your content calendar now filling up with more quality content? It's going to be in your cross-channel analytics tools. In other words, tracking how your podcasts are converting into to blog posts. Are you actually making more blogs from that? Are your videos creating more blogs? Are you able to track perhaps maybe with a UTM or a customer journey, how that information that you're creating, imagine now, remember, you're creating a lot more content now that's quality. How is that translating back down to the bottom of that funnel we just showed you a moment ago? Also, are you now able to collaborate better with your sales team who can utilize that content because you're giving them better content to answer the questions that you've discussed with your experts in your podcast? So now I've given you the what, how to measure it, what to measure. You may be thinking this is a lot. How do we create all this content? Well, you may already have the resources in-house to do that, and that's good. If you don't, you may need a partner to do so. But before you do it, ask these questions, because every outsource or every agency, in fact, agencies get a bad rap for this because they're not all created equal. So I'm going to give you some questions to ask before you seek outside assistance in creating your podcast or content. First of all, do they provide additional marketing expertise? They need to understand your why. They need to understand, why are you creating this podcast? Who is your audience? If they don't understand that, if they don't have any marketing expertise, they're going to be shooting for giving you big numbers that mean nothing to your bottom line. Do they understand enough to consult you along the way? Are they familiar with working with a business or organization your size? Doing editing for a personal podcast or an ego podcast or entertainment podcast is nothing like the load it takes to communicate with the business, because you have compliance, you have to deal with processes, you may have a lot of things in the pipeline at once. Are they familiar with working with the business your size? That's a very, very important part to be sure of. Also, do they insist in the recording? Can they actually help you record the podcast, or do they say, you record it yourself and send it to us? That's just an editing company. That's not an agency. Can they provide voiceover assistance when needed? Can they step in and voice intros or outros or help you with that, or even coach you along the way with your host being better voiceover as they introduce your podcast? Can they help with, as you mentioned earlier, writing content and repurposing your content? And also, do they help you distribute that content once it's created? All that's important, okay? So I should have mentioned earlier, and I hope maybe we had that in the chat earlier, but I don't want this to be something that you just hear and you can't take action from. So we have a guide called the Actionable Guide. You can guess the original title was not actionable until we went back and said, you know what? This has much more value if a person can take action. So Elena, please put that in the chat. The Actionable Guide to Scaling Content Creation Through Podcasting. You can take it on your phone. I guess you're on a computer now, so maybe you can't do that, or you're on your phone. So the URL's there. We'll put the URL in the comments, and we'll also put it in later on after the session too, to make sure you have access to that. The Actionable Guide to Scaling Content Generation Through Podcasting. Remember, this series is called the Zero Listen Podcast. How do you get ROI from a zero listen podcast? So I'm Ailey Judge. Thank you for attending today. This is part 1 of the Zero Listen podcast, how to get content ROI from podcasting.